My name is Jessica Cooley, and at 39 years old, I pinned the star of a general onto the shoulder of my United States Army uniform. But my story didn't start at the Pentagon. It started on a bitterly cold winter night in Maine when I was just 18. When my father, a man respected by the entire town, looked me dead in the eye and declared with ice in his voice, "The thing in your belly is a sin, and you are its vessel. This house will not be defiled by you any longer." I can still see my brother's smug smile as he whispered, "Finally, the trash is taking itself out." They threw me out into the snow, with a single suitcase and the tiny, growing life inside me, and left me for dead. But they could have never imagined that the girl they discarded that day would one day command thousands of soldiers, and that they would be the ones standing at attention for her. Let me know where you're watching from, hit that like button, and subscribe if you believe that true strength is born from the pieces others throw away. The air in our living room was thick with the scent of pine from the fireplace and the lie of family warmth. Outside, a January blizzard was raging against the windows of our Kennebunkport home, but inside, the only storm was the one gathering in my father's eyes. Arthur Cooley sat in his worn leather armchair, the one that was more throne than chair, his hands steepled under his chin. He wasn't yelling. He never yelled. His power didn't come from volume. It came from the chilling, deliberate calm with which he could dismantle a person's world. He spoke about the Cooley family honor as if he were giving a lecture at the town hall. His voice a low, resonant hum that filled the oppressive silence. He didn't look at me, not at first. His gaze was fixed on a point just below my heart, on the slight curve of my stomach hidden beneath my sweater. That's where his shame lived now, inside me. "We will tell people you've gone to Boston," he announced, his tone as flat and final as a judge's gavel. "To care for an ailing aunt. The matter will be handled. Quietly." The word matter hung in the air, a cold, clinical term for the child I already loved more than my own life. My hands, resting protectively on my belly, began to tremble. I found a sliver of my voice, a sound so thin and fragile I barely recognized it as my own. "But, Dad, this is my baby." For the first time that night, his eyes lifted to meet mine. They were the color of the winter ocean just beyond our shore, gray and unforgiving. The ice in them seemed to freeze the very air between us. "It is not my grandchild," he stated, each word a perfectly formed shard of glass. "And from this moment on, you are not my daughter." There was no room for argument, no space for a plea. It wasn't a punishment, it was an erasure. A sentence had been passed, and my existence in this house was officially over. My breath caught in my throat, a ragged, painful gasp. My gaze darted desperately across the room, searching for an ally, a lifeline. I found my mother, Eleanor, standing by the large bay window. She was wringing her hands, her knuckles white. I could see the sheen of tears in her eyes, but she wouldn't look at me. She just stared out at the swirling snow, a statue carved from fear and silence. I mouthed the word, "Mom," and she gave the slightest shake of her head. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement that screamed a single, deafening message. "I can't help you." Then my eyes fell on my brother, Daniel. He was leaning against the far wall, arms crossed over his chest, a faint, cruel smirk playing on his lips. He was the golden boy, the one destined for law school and a corner office. He was also the one who had found my pregnancy test in the trash and, with gleeful righteousness, had delivered the news to our father. The look on his face wasn't just satisfaction, it was triumph. My father's words were the blade, but my mother's silence and my brother's smile were the poison that coated it. This was a complete betrayal, executed by the three people who were supposed to be my world. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. "Daniel," my father commanded, his voice unchanged, "get her out of here." Daniel pushed himself off the wall with an eagerness that made my stomach clench. He moved toward the closet under the stairs and pulled out my old, battered suitcase, the one I used for summer camp years ago. He didn't hand it to me. He dragged it across the hardwood floor, the sound screeching through the quiet room, and threw it onto the front porch with such force that the cheap latch broke. The lid flew open, and the contents of my life, a few sweaters, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, a photograph of a friend, spilled out onto the snow-dusted wood. Humiliation burned through me, hot and acidic. I stumbled outside into the biting cold, the shock of the frigid air a physical blow. Kneeling on the porch, my fingers numb, I started stuffing my clothes back into the broken case. Hot tears streamed down my face, freezing almost instantly on my cheeks. Daniel stood over me on the top step, a looming silhouette against the warm light of the doorway. He looked down at me, his eyes filled with a disgust so pure it felt like a physical strike. "Should have thought about the consequences before you spread your legs, little sister," he sneered, his voice low and laced with venom. The words hit me harder than a slap. They were crude, ugly, and designed to strip me of any remaining shred of dignity. I snapped the suitcase shut, the broken latch refusing to hold, and pushed myself to my feet. I wouldn't let him see me break completely. I stood there for a moment, a ghost on my own front porch, as the snow began to fall heavier, the flakes melting in my hair. The raw, salty wind of the Atlantic whipped around me, carrying the scent of a storm from the coast. I risked one last look back at the house. Through the living room window, I saw my mother's silhouette as she pulled back the lace curtain, just for a second. Our eyes met across the snowy yard, a silent, final exchange. Then, as if my gaze had physically burned her, she let the curtain fall. The golden light from the dining room spilled onto the lawn, a warm, inviting glow. I could still smell the lingering aroma of the roast chicken and apple pie we'd had for dinner, a meal that now felt like a Last Supper. Then the heavy oak door swung shut. It didn't slam. It closed with a solid, definitive thud, followed by the dry, final click of the deadbolt sliding into place. That single sound was the punctuation mark at the end of my childhood. It severed me from everything I'd ever known. I hadn't just lost a home. I'd been stripped of my name, my past, my very identity. They didn't even bother to pull the drapes. To them, I was already invisible. The door clicking shut wasn't just a sound. It was the final punctuation on the 18 years I had called my life. The wind cut through my thin coat, but the cold I felt was nothing compared to the cavernous chill that had settled in my bones. I eventually found my way to a deserted bus station a few miles from my house, the fluorescent lights humming a lonely tune. Huddled on a hard plastic bench, I watched my breath plume in the frigid air. The image of my family's warm, bright window, with their moving silhouettes inside, was burned onto the back of my eyelids. They hadn't just thrown me out, they had continued on, as if my chair at the table had always been empty. That night wasn't an isolated act of cruelty. It was simply the finale of a lifetime of rehearsals. My childhood was a carefully drawn map of favoritism, and I was never the destination. The lines were drawn early, clearly, and always in my brother Daniel's favor. I remember one Christmas morning when I was 9. Under the tree was a gleaming, candy apple red Schwinn bicycle for Daniel. It was perfect, the chrome handlebars shining under the Christmas lights. And for me, there was a blue bicycle. At first, I was thrilled, but as I got closer, I saw it. Underneath the sloppy coat of blue paint, I could see the ghost of a familiar scratch on the fender from when Daniel had crashed his old bike the summer before. They hadn't bought me a bike. They had just painted over his leftovers. My father clapped me on the shoulder, his touch light and dismissive. "There you go, kiddo," he'd said with a chuckle. "You're a girl, what do you need a fancy new bike for? As long as it rides, right?" The rest of the family gathered around Daniel, oohing and aahing over his shiny new prize, while I stood next to my second-hand, second-best gift. It was about the message, delivered as clearly as the morning paper. You get what's left over. You are the afterthought. That feeling became the wallpaper of my youth. But the memory that truly aches, the one that feels like a permanent fracture in my soul, happened when I was 17. I had worked tirelessly, staying up late studying, pouring everything I had into my schoolwork because it was the one arena where I felt I could be more than Daniel's little sister. And I did it. I got a letter from the University of Maine. I had been accepted into their computer science program on a full scholarship, a full ride. I remember sinking to the floor, the letter clutched to my chest, crying with a joy so pure it felt like flying. For the first time, I had something that was truly, undeniably mine. I waited until dinner, my heart thrumming, ready to share the news that would finally make them see me. I got in, I said, my voice trembling with pride. University of Maine, full scholarship. My father didn't look up from his newspaper. He finished the paragraph he was reading before slowly folding it beside his plate. He glanced at the envelope, then at me, his expression unreadable. A scholarship is good, he said, but Daniel will be applying to private schools next year, more prestigious ones. All our attention, all our resources need to be focused on his future. You can go to the community college here. My mother chimed in, her voice gentle, as if softening the blow when she was really twisting the knife. That's right, honey. Stay close to home. You can help me around the house. Just like that, my dream was extinguished. They didn't shout. They simply dismissed it as if my years of hard work, my brilliant future, was a minor inconvenience to the grand plan of Daniel's success. The world I had seen opening up, a world of code and a life I built for myself, shrank back down to the four walls of that house. The last Thanksgiving I spent with them was the clearest picture of my place in the Cooley family. Daniel brought his new girlfriend home. My mother had been cooking for 2 days, the house filled with the smells of roast turkey and pumpkin pie. My father opened a bottle of expensive red wine. The entire evening was an orbit around Daniel, his football stats, his plans for college. I was a spectator, a ghost at the feast. I tried once to join the conversation, mentioning a science project I had just won an award for. My father held up a hand, cutting me off. Later, Jessa. We're talking about Daniel's future. I fell silent, looking down at my plate piled high with food I no longer had the appetite to eat. I was at a table laden with abundance, yet I had never felt so starved. Starved for a moment of their attention, for a crumb of their approval. Sitting on that cold bus station bench, these memories weren't just ghosts, they were evidence. Evidence in a trial that had been convicting me my whole life. But then, another memory surfaced, a softer one. It was my grandmother, my mother's mother. She was the only one who ever looked at me like I was the main character. Shortly before she passed, she had held my hand in her wrinkled, gentle one. Her eyes, faded but sharp, had looked right into me. Jessa, she'd whispered, her voice papery thin. You have a fire inside you. Don't you ever let anyone put it out. Not even the people you love the most. At the time, I hadn't understood. But now, her words echoed in the empty station. A faint, warm glow in the suffocating darkness. That fire she saw was almost down to embers, choked by years of being told I wasn't enough. But it wasn't out. Not yet. She was the only one who had ever truly seen me. And for her, for the memory of her belief in me, I had to keep it burning. If you've ever been made to feel like the second choice, like your dreams didn't matter as much as someone else's, please support this story by hitting the like button. And in the comments below, just type the word FIRE to let me know you're still fighting to keep your own flame alive. I pulled the last of my money from my pocket. A single, crumpled $20 bill. It was all I had. I stared at the face of Andrew Jackson. They spent my whole life telling me I was nothing without them. Now, without them, who could I become? The question hung in the cold air, not as a whisper of despair, but as the quiet, defiant crackle of a single, surviving ember. The question of who I could become was answered not with a grand revelation, but with the relentless, grinding reality of survival. With my $20, I bought a bus ticket to Portland, Maine. It was the biggest city I could reach, a place anonymous enough to swallow my past. My first home as a free woman was a cramped attic apartment above a noisy diner. The air was permanently saturated with the smell of stale coffee and sizzling bacon grease, a scent that clung to my clothes, my hair, and every page of the few books I owned. Below me, the diner was a constant cacophony of shouting cooks, clattering plates, and the jukebox that only seemed to have 3 songs. That tiny, grimy room was my sanctuary and my prison. My life became a brutal, repeating loop, a marathon with no finish line. My day started at 5 a.m. From 6 until 2 in the afternoon, I was a waitress at the diner downstairs. I learned to balance 4 heavy plates on one arm, to smile when my feet felt like 2 blocks of burning cement inside my cheap sneakers, and to navigate the narrow aisles with a growing belly that was becoming harder to hide. The pay was minimal, the tips even less so. Then, from 5 in the afternoon until midnight, I had a second job washing dishes at a seafood restaurant down by the wharf. I'd stand for hours in front of a giant industrial sink, my hands plunged into scalding, soapy water, scrubbing away at the remnants of other people's expensive meals. The harsh chemicals turned my hands raw and calloused, the skin cracking and bleeding in the cold air. Food was whatever was left over at the end of my shift. A half-eaten basket of fries, a bowl of clam chowder that was about to be tossed. I'd eat quickly, standing in the steamy kitchen, before starting the long walk home. Every dollar, every quarter, was meticulously counted and tucked away in an old coffee can for the baby. For my daughter. The physical exhaustion was a constant, heavy blanket I couldn't shake off. But some days, the hollowness inside, the profound loneliness, was a sharper pain than my aching back or swollen feet. Being pregnant and alone in a new city made me a target for whispers and judgmental stares. I could feel them, the sideways glances from other waitresses, the disapproving frowns from older customers. One afternoon, a woman at a corner booth, a regular with perfectly coiffed gray hair, had been watching me all morning. When she left, I went to clear her table and saw she had left no tip. Instead, there was a note, scrawled on a napkin in neat cursive. "You should have kept your legs closed." I stood there for a moment, the napkin trembling in my hand. The same shame my father had tried to brand me with had followed me here. It was in the air, in the eyes of strangers. I didn't cry. I simply crumpled the napkin into a tight ball, my heart constricting in my chest, and threw it in the trash with the leftover scraps of her lunch. I learned to build an invisible wall around myself. My waitress smile became a mask, a piece of armor to hide the wounds that were still weeping underneath. My greatest fear wasn't the loneliness or the judgment. It was failure. It was the terrifying possibility of being evicted, of having nowhere to go when the baby arrived. That fear took the form of a single piece of paper. One day, a bright red overdue rent notice was tacked to my apartment door. Seeing it felt like a punch to the gut. My landlord, a gruff man who seemed to have a permanent scowl, had made it clear he offered no second chances. I took the notice inside, but I didn't hide it. I didn't cry. Instead, I taped it to the cracked wall across from my lumpy mattress. Next to the menacing red number, I took a pen that was nearly out of ink and wrote 3 small words. Just one more day. It became my mantra, my prayer, my battle cry. Every morning when I woke up before the exhaustion had fully set in, I would look at that notice. It wasn't a symbol of defeat, it was my reason to fight. I just had to get through the next 24 hours, survive one more shift, earn one more day's rent. It wasn't living, it was existing, one sunrise at a time. And every single night, no matter how tired I was, no matter how much my body ached, I had a ritual. I would lie down on my mattress, place my chapped hands on my swelling belly, and feel the gentle flutter of the life inside me. I would whisper into the darkness of my tiny room, my voice soft but steady. "I'm here, little one. I'm right here. I will never, ever leave you." That promise was my anchor in the storm. It was the one thing that kept me from letting the current pull me under. Rachel was born on a stormy October night, the rain lashing against my single window, the wind howling like a lonely wolf. She was born right there, in that attic room, with the help of a kind, elderly midwife I'd paid for in small weekly installments. The moment the midwife placed her in my arms, a tiny, wailing, beautiful bundle, the world outside fell silent. All the pain, the fear, the months of grinding exhaustion, it all just dissolved. As I looked at her, so perfect and new, I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated joy for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Her tiny fingers wrapped around one of my own, her grip surprisingly strong. Looking into her clear, dark eyes, I whispered the promise that had now become my life's mission. "I am going to build you a fortress, Rachel. A fortress that no one can ever touch." The days that followed were a blur of sleeplessness and a love so fierce it terrified me. The diner downstairs was my daily battleground. Most customers were a faceless stream of orders and demands. But there was one man, an older gentleman who always sat at the end of the counter. He had short gray hair, a quiet demeanor, and eyes that seemed to see more than most. Every morning, he'd order a black coffee and read his newspaper, a silent fixture in my chaotic world. I'd refill his cup, we'd nod, and that was it. Until one particularly brutal Tuesday. A customer had yelled at me for mixing up his order. Rachel had been up all night with a fever, and I felt myself swaying on my feet, a wave of dizziness washing over me. As I placed a fresh pot of coffee on the burner, my hands shook so badly I almost dropped it. And that's when he broke the silence. He looked up from his paper, his gaze steady and concerned. "You okay, kid?" It was just 4 words, but in a world that had offered me nothing but judgment and indifference, it felt like a lifeline. The question, "You okay, kid?" hung in the greasy diner air. It was so unexpected, so out of place in my world of transactions and invisibility, that for a moment I didn't know how to respond. My carefully constructed wall, the one that held back the exhaustion and the tears, suddenly had a crack in it. I just looked at him, the old man at the counter, and gave a weak, unconvincing nod. He didn't press. He just nodded back, a silent acknowledgement, and went back to his newspaper. But something had shifted. The interaction was brief, but it was the first drop of rain on a parched, emotional landscape. His name was Frank Riley. I learned that from the name on his credit card one day. He was a creature of habit. Every morning at 7, he'd take the same stool at the end of the counter, order a black coffee, and read the paper cover to cover. He was a former Marine sergeant, I'd eventually learn, with a quiet intensity and a gaze that seemed to peel back layers. He never made small talk, never asked personal questions. But I started to realize he wasn't just sitting there. He was observing. He didn't look at me with pity, the way some of the other customers did when they noticed the dark circles under my eyes or the slight tremor in my hands. He didn't look at me with judgment either. He watched me the way a hawk watches the wind, assessing, calculating. He saw the efficiency in my movements, the grit in my posture as I worked through the morning rush, handling 3, sometimes 4 tables at once without ever losing my cool. He wasn't seeing a struggling single mother. He was seeing a soldier in the trenches. The dam finally broke on a miserable Tuesday afternoon. The lunch rush had been a nightmare. I was running on 3 hours of sleep, and a businessman at table 4 had berated me for 5 minutes because his burger was medium well instead of medium. I felt the familiar sting of tears threatening, but blinked them back, my jaw tight. After he left, I was clearing his table when Frank's low, gravelly voice cut through the diner's noise. "Hey, Cooley." He'd learned my last name from my name tag. I walked over to the counter, expecting him to want a refill. Instead, he folded his newspaper deliberately and looked me straight in the eye. "Don't let them get to you," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. I was in Vietnam. I know what a fighter looks like. They aren't the ones who aren't afraid. They're the ones who act in spite of the fear. You've got that in you. I was stunned into silence. In the year since I'd left home, people had called me a lot of things, directly or indirectly. A sinner, a charity case, irresponsible. But no one, not once, had ever called me strong. Frank's words weren't a compliment. They were a statement of fact, a diagnosis of my spirit. It was like he had reached past the tired waitress uniform and seen the warrior underneath. I felt a jolt, a current of warmth that spread through my chest, pushing back against the cold that had lived there for so long. All I could do was whisper a small, "Thank you." He didn't offer a solution that day. He didn't give me advice. Instead, a few days later, he slid a small yellowed newspaper clipping across the counter with my tip. "Read this when you get a chance," was all he said. That night, in the quiet of my attic room, with Rachel sleeping soundly in her makeshift crib, I unfolded the delicate piece of paper. The light from my small lamp was dim, but the words were powerful enough to burn through the gloom. It was a quote attributed to Theodore Roosevelt. "It is not the critic who counts, The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, but who does actually strive to do the deeds. Tears welled in my eyes and spilled onto my cheeks, but these were different tears. They weren't born of shame or self-pity. They were tears of recognition. My father, with his cold pronouncements of honor. My brother, with his smug, cruel whispers. The woman with her judgmental note. They were the critics, sitting safely in the stands, pointing out how I stumbled. But me? I was the one in the arena. My face was marred by the grease of the diner and the tears of exhaustion. My hands were calloused from the fight. I was the one striving, falling, and getting back up. For the first time, I saw my struggle not as a mark of shame, but as a badge of honor. A week later, Frank finally brought up the military. He was direct, no sugarcoating. He didn't sell it as a magical solution. He talked about the discipline, the sacrifice, the long nights away from home that would be especially hard for a mother. But then he talked about the things I craved, like a starving person craves food, stability, a steady paycheck, health insurance for Rachel. The GI Bill, which meant a college education, the one that had been stolen from me, was still possible. And most importantly, he talked about brotherhood, camaraderie. A family forged in shared hardship, built on merit and respect, not on the accident of blood. The army won't give you an easy life, Cooley, he said, stirring his coffee, his gaze fixed on the black liquid. It's not designed for that. But it will give you a fair shot to fight for one. And for a soldier, a fair shot is all you can ask for. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a small, crisp business card. It was for the local U.S. Army recruitment office. He laid it on the counter between us. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for it. The card felt heavy, dense with the weight of a decision I never thought I'd have to make. That night, I didn't put it in a drawer to be forgotten. As I changed Rachel's diaper, I slipped it into the side pocket of her diaper bag, right next to the baby wipes and a spare pacifier. The card lay there, amongst the things that belonged to my daughter's future. I wasn't ready yet, but for the first time in a very long time, I saw a door, instead of just walls. The door Frank had opened remained just a sliver of light in my mind, a possibility I wasn't yet brave enough to consider. For nearly a year, my life had settled into a rhythm of survival, and my past had become a distant, silent ache. Then, a letter arrived. The envelope was a soft cream color, my name and address written in my mother's familiar, elegant script. It was the first contact of any kind since that night. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter was filled with carefully chosen words of counterfeit remorse. She missed me, she wrote. She thought of me every day. My father had calmed down considerably and was asking about his granddaughter. They wanted to see Rachel. They wanted to see me. As I read those words, a stupid, fragile sliver of hope pushed its way through the hardened soil of my heart. It was a foolish hope, the kind you know is dangerous but can't help but feel. Maybe the birth of a child, an innocent baby, really had softened them. Maybe time had granted them perspective. Maybe they finally realized what they had lost. I was naive enough to let myself believe it. We agreed to meet at a neutral, anonymous coffee shop halfway between Portland and Kennebunkport. I arrived early, my stomach churning with a mixture of anxiety and that treacherous hope. My father didn't come. It was just my mother and Daniel, sitting at a small table by the window. My mother looked older, thinner, the lines of worry etched deeper around her eyes. Daniel looked exactly the same, smug, entitled, his expensive sweater a stark contrast to my own worn-out coat. He glanced at Rachel, who was sleeping peacefully in her stroller, with a look of cold curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen. My mother slid an envelope of cash across the table, along with a bag of new baby clothes. "For you and the baby," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. The first few minutes were a strained dance of pleasantries. They asked how I was managing. I gave vague, one-word answers. They remarked on how beautiful Rachel was. The conversation felt like walking on a frozen lake, the ice thin and cracking with every step. Then, Daniel began. Look at her, so precious, he said, leaning forward to peer at Rachel, his voice dripping with faux sentimentality. She deserves a proper home, Jessa. A real father, a future. You can't give her those things, not really. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a reconciliation, this was an ambush. My mother picked up where he left off, her tone gentle, loving, which made the words themselves feel like 1,000 tiny cuts. Jessa, honey, your father and I have been talking. We've found the perfect solution. She reached across the table, trying to take my hand. We want you to let Daniel and his wife adopt Rachel. The world stopped. The background noise of the coffee shop, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of conversations, faded into a dull roar in my ears. I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. But the earnest, resolute look on her face told me I hadn't. They've been having trouble conceiving, she continued, as if explaining a simple business proposition. Rachel would have a complete life, a proper family, a father who can provide for her. And you could still be in her life, of course. You could visit. It's the best thing for everyone, especially for the child. I sat there frozen, my hand still clutching my now cold cup of coffee. They didn't want to heal. They wanted to erase me again. But this time, it was worse. They wanted to strip me of the one identity that had given me the strength to survive. My role as a mother. They wanted my daughter. I finally found my voice, a strangled whisper. No. Daniel's face hardened, the mask of concern dropping away to reveal the familiar sneer beneath. Don't be so selfish, Jessa, he snapped, his voice rising. You're ruining her life out of your own stupid pride. Dad was right about you. You were just the vessel. The word vessel hit me with the force of a physical blow, throwing me back to that horrible night on the porch. My mother saw the look on my face and tightened her grip on my arm, her eyes welling with theatrical tears. Think of her soul, Jessa, she pleaded, her voice taking on a righteous, pious tone. She needs to be raised in a God-fearing home. Your father quotes the scripture about saving the innocent. This is her salvation. We're offering to bring her into the grace of the Lord. I snatched my hand back as if her touch had burned me. The hypocrisy was suffocating, the manipulation so profound it made me want to scream. They were using God as a weapon, twisting faith into a justification for their cruelty. This wasn't about Rachel's soul. This was about their reputation, their control. I stood up so quickly my chair scraped loudly against the floor. I reached into the stroller and lifted my sleeping daughter into my arms. Her solid, warm weight against my chest was the only real thing in the room. It was my anchor, my truth. She already has a family, I said, my voice low and shaking with a rage so deep it terrified me. She has me, and that is all she needs. I turned and walked away, not looking back. I left them sitting there, with their cash and their baby clothes and their self-righteous expressions. The faces of people who had convinced themselves that cruelty was a form of love. The walk back to the bus station was a blur. When I finally got back to the suffocating quiet of my attic room, I gently laid Rachel in her crib. She stirred for a moment, then settled back to sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm of perfect innocence, and I finally broke. I slid down the wall, my body shaking with silent, racking sobs. It wasn't just anger. It was raw, primal fear. They had money. They had influence. My father was a respected man. What was to stop them from coming back with lawyers and court orders, painting me as an unfit, sinful mother? They had the power to take her from me. My wild, terrified gaze fell upon the diaper bag in the corner, the business card. Frank's words echoed in my head. A fair shot to fight. My fear began to curdle, hardening into something else. Something cold and sharp. Resolve. I crawled over to the bag, my hands still shaking, and pulled out the card. I stared at the crisp, black letters, United States Army. They wanted to take everything from me, my past, my future, and now my child. They wouldn't stop. I couldn't fight them with a waitress's tips and a broken heart. I couldn't fight them alone. I needed a uniform, I needed a fortress, I needed an army at my back. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's tear-filled, pleading face and my brother's predatory smile. The four walls of my tiny attic room felt like they were closing in, squeezing the very air from my lungs. I held Rachel to my chest, her warmth a fragile shield against the cold terror that gripped me. My mind raced, painting vivid, horrifying scenarios. I could see them showing up with a lawyer, a man in an expensive suit holding a stack of legal documents. I could hear them in a courtroom, my father using his respected community standing, my mother crying on the witness stand, both of them testifying about my instability, my sin. They had money, connections, and the power of public opinion on their side. I had nothing but a fierce, desperate love for my child. The helplessness was a physical weight, pressing down on me, threatening to crush what little fight I had left. But then, something else rose through the fear. It started as a low burn in the pit of my stomach and spread through my veins like wildfire. It was rage, a pure, clarifying rage that burned away the panic. I looked down at my daughter's perfect sleeping face, her tiny hand curled around my finger. They had taken my childhood. They had taken my dreams. They would not take my daughter. A single, resolute thought cut through the chaos in my mind. They will not win. I would not let them. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through my window, I reached for the business card on my nightstand. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer in control. My fingers were steady as I dialed the number. A man with a tired, professional voice answered. U.S. Army Recruiting, Sergeant Miller speaking. My voice, when it came out, was clear and hard, devoid of the tremor that had plagued it for the last year. My name is Jessica Cooley. I want to enlist. Immediately. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Ma'am, the process takes... I understand, I cut him off. I'm ready now. He asked the inevitable questions, his tone shifting slightly when I told him I was 20 years old with an infant daughter. Having a child can make service very difficult, Ms. Cooley, he said, a note of caution in his voice. Sergeant, I replied, and my voice was like steel. It is because of my daughter that I am calling. He fell silent for another moment. Then his tone changed again, this time to one of respect. All right, Cooley, come down to the office at 800. I had found my unshakable reason. I wasn't running from my past anymore. I was building a fortress to protect my future. The process was a whirlwind of paperwork, tests, and physical evaluations. I moved through it all in a focused haze, my determination a shield against any doubt. I scored surprisingly high on the ASVAB, the aptitude test, especially in the technical sections, a ghost of the computer science scholarship I never got to use. I passed the physical with ease. Months of carrying heavy trays and scrubbing floors had made me stronger than I knew. Finally, I sat across the desk from Sergeant Miller with a mountain of enlistment papers in front of me. He explained everything in detail, the length of my contract, the risks, the benefits. I listened, but my decision was already made. When he pushed the final signature page in front of me, I didn't hesitate. I picked up the pen and signed my name, Jessica Cooley, on the line. Each stroke of the pen felt like a sacred vow. The signature that committed me to years of service to my country was also the signature on my own personal Declaration of Independence. I was officially severing the final toxic tie to the family that had discarded me. I was creating a new lineage, a new legacy, one that would begin with Private Jessica Cooley and her daughter Rachel. Before I left for the diner to say my goodbyes, I stopped by Frank's stool. He was there, as always, with his black coffee and newspaper. I didn't have the words to properly thank him for what he'd done, for seeing me when no one else had, so I said the only thing that felt right. I'm not going to let you down, I told him, my voice steady. He looked up at me, a long appraising look. A rare, small smile touched the corners of his mouth. He nodded slowly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy bronze coin, pressing it into my palm. This is a challenge coin, he said, his voice low. Keep it. When you feel like quitting, you hold on to this, and you remember why you started. The weight of the coin in my hand felt like the weight of his belief in me. It was more than I'd ever gotten from my own father. There was one last thing I had to do. Before turning in my personal effects, I stood outside the recruitment office and made one final call. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice laced with a wary, "Hello?" "Mom," I said. My voice was calm, almost detached, as if I were a stranger delivering a message. "I'm calling to inform you and Dad that I have enlisted in the United States Army. Rachel and I will be under their care and protection now." I could hear her sharp intake of breath, the start of a protest. I didn't let her speak. "Do not ever," I continued, my voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper, "think about trying to take her. Because if you do, you won't just be coming up against me, you'll be coming up against the entire United States Army." I ended the call before she could form a reply. The click of the phone disconnecting was the most liberating sound I had ever heard. It wasn't just a conversation I had ended, it was a lifetime of fear. The recruiter who processed my final papers, a different sergeant, handed me my travel orders. "Welcome to the United States Army, Coolie," he said with a tired grin. "Your life will never be the same." He was right. When I walked out of that office and into the bright afternoon sun, I was no longer Jessa Cooley, the outcast, the vessel, the girl thrown into the snow. I was Private Cooley, and I had a war to win. If you've ever had to make a drastic decision to protect yourself or your loved ones, please hit the like button for Jessa's courage. In the comments, just write the word warrior if you believe she made the right choice. The bus ride to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, was a descent into a new world. The lush green landscape of Maine gave way to the humid, oppressive heat of the South. From the moment I stepped off that bus, my old life was over. My civilian clothes were stripped away, my hair was cut, and my identity was reduced to the name stenciled on my uniform, Coolie. On day one, I was already a target. At 20 years old, I was an elder among a sea of fresh-faced 18-year-olds straight out of high school. My drill sergeant, a man built like a bulldog with a voice like gravel in a blender, got right in my face, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee. "Coolie, you think this is some kind of resort for single moms?" he bellowed, his voice echoing across the formation. "There is no weakness here. Do you understand me?" A few of the other recruits snickered. One girl in the bunk next to mine, a tough kid from Chicago named Diaz, started calling me Grandma. I didn't react. I just clenched my jaw, stared straight ahead into the drill sergeant's furious eyes, and screamed the only answer aloud, "Yes, drill sergeant!" The physical pain they were about to inflict on me was nothing compared to the insults I had already survived. This was just a different kind of fire. Every day at Fort Jackson was a calculated exercise in breaking us down to build us back up as soldiers. We ran for miles under the scorching South Carolina sun until our lungs burned. We low-crawled through mud pits under live ammunition and barbed wire that tore at our uniforms. We learned to field strip and reassemble our M16 rifles in the pitch dark until our fingers were numb and our movements were pure muscle memory. My body screamed in protest. Every muscle ached, my shins throbbed, and my feet were a mass of blisters. But my hardest battle began when the training day ended. Each night, after a grueling 14-hour day, I fought a war on two fronts. While the other recruits collapsed onto their bunks, I would make a frantic dash to the family housing unit on the other side of the base. The Army had assigned a caregiver, a kind but firm older woman, to watch Rachel. I had exactly 1 hour, one precious hour to be a mother. I'd rush in, my uniform still caked with mud, and scoop my daughter into my arms. In that hour, I had to bathe her, feed her, read her a story, and kiss her goodnight, all while my body was screaming for rest. The guilt was a constant gnawing presence. Leaving her crying in her crib each night to run back to the barracks before lights out felt like tearing a piece of my own soul out. It was during those agonizing nights that the challenge coin Frank had given me became my anchor. I'd sit on the edge of my bunk in the dark, the heavy coin cold in my palm, and remember his words, "Remember why you started." I started this for her. Every push-up, every mile, every moment of pain was for Rachel. I wasn't just building a soldier, I was building her fortress, brick by painful brick. At first, the drill sergeant saw me as a liability, the single mom who was bound to wash out. But as the weeks wore on, they started to see something else. They realized that being a mother hadn't made me weaker. It had forged me in a way they couldn't replicate. It had given me a resilience and maturity that the younger recruits lacked. I never complained. When the 18-year-olds cried from homesickness, I was silently cleaning my rifle, my focus absolute. I had a reason to fight that was bigger than all of theirs combined. The shift was subtle. The snickers stopped. The nickname, Grandma, faded away. One day, during a particularly brutal ruck march, Diaz, the girl who had mocked me, collapsed, her leg seizing with a vicious cramp. The order was to keep moving. But I stopped. I dropped my pack, helped her to her feet, and slung her arm over my shoulder. We finished the last 2 miles together, her leaning on me, both of us struggling but refusing to quit. From that day on, she wasn't just Diaz, she was my sister. Slowly, the drill sergeant's scorn turned into a grudging respect. He started using me as an example. "Look at Cooley," he'd roar at a recruit who was struggling. "She's got more reason to quit than any of you, but she's still here. She's still pushing." "What's your excuse?" My defining moment came during our final field training exercise, the Forge. It was the culmination of everything we'd learned. During a timed obstacle course, a male recruit in my squad went over a wall awkwardly and landed badly, his ankle twisting with a sickening crunch. He was down, stuck. The drill sergeant's command crackled over the radio. "Leave him, complete the mission." It was a test of our priorities, the mission or the man. I didn't hesitate. I disobeyed the order. I ran back, used the combat first aid I'd been taught to stabilize his ankle, and with Diaz's help, we practically carried him across the finish line, coming in dead last. I stood at attention, bracing for the worst punishment of my life. Instead, my company captain called me into his office later that day. I stood before his desk, my heart pounding. "You disobeyed a direct order today, Private Cooley," he said, his voice calm. "Yes, sir," I replied, my own voice steady. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. "You put your fellow soldier ahead of the mission," he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You don't just have the makings of a soldier, Cooley. You have the makings of a leader." 10 weeks after arriving as a broken young woman, I stood on the graduation field, transformed. I was no longer just Jessa. I was a soldier in the United States Army. And I wasn't just any soldier. I was the distinguished honor graduate of my company, the #1 trainee out of 200. As my name was called, I scanned the crowd of cheering families. And I saw her. Rachel, sitting on our caregiver's lap, clapping her tiny hands and waving a small American flag. Our eyes met across the field, and in that moment, all the pain, all the sacrifice, became worth it. The honor grad star on my uniform today was just the beginning. I would earn all the other stars. For her. The title of honor graduate wasn't just an award, it was a key. My company captain, the man who had seen leadership in my act of defiance, pulled me aside after graduation. He told me that my test scores and my performance record made me a prime candidate for officer candidate school. "Don't waste that potential, Cooley," he'd said. "Enlisted soldiers win battles. Officers lead them." His words resonated with the promise I had made to myself, the promise to earn all the stars. So, I applied. Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia, made basic training feel like a summer camp. It was a relentless intellectual and psychological crucible designed to find the breaking point of every candidate. We were pushed physically, but the real war was fought in our minds. Late nights studying strategy, early mornings leading tactical exercises, and constant evaluations of our leadership abilities. I thrived in that environment. The pressure, the exhaustion, it was all familiar territory. But here, for the first time, my efforts were not only seen, they were rewarded. I graduated as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. The day of my commissioning ceremony was bright and sunny. Standing on that parade field in my crisp new uniform, I felt a sense of pride so profound it was almost overwhelming. But the proudest moment of my life came when they called for a family member to pin on my new rank. A small figure detached herself from the crowd and walked toward me with solemn importance. It was Rachel. Now 5 years old, she was dressed in a pretty blue dress, her face a perfect mixture of awe and concentration. With the help of my captain, she carefully pinned the single gold bar of a second lieutenant onto my shoulder. A photographer captured that moment. My daughter, my reason for everything, officially making me an officer. That photograph would become the first and most important piece in the collection on my wall, the start of my new family legacy. But life as a young officer and a single mother was a tightrope walk over a canyon of guilt and sacrifice. My days were a blur of responsibility. I'd stay up half the night meticulously planning platoon movements or studying field manuals, only to be up at 600 to make Rachel breakfast and braid her hair before dropping her at the on-base daycare. The sacrifices were constant, and they cut deep. I missed her first school play because I was in the middle of a month-long field training exercise. I listened to her sing her song over a crackling satellite phone, my heart aching with a pain that no physical exertion could match. The guilt was a constant companion, a shadow I could never quite outrun. But I learned to turn it into fuel. I would look at her picture taped inside my helmet and remind myself that every long day, every missed bedtime story, was an investment in her future. I was building her fortress, and fortresses require sacrifice. It was during a conversation with an army chaplain, a kind man with gentle eyes, that I found a new perspective. He wasn't preachy, but he shared a verse from the Bible that stuck with me. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. For me, it wasn't just about faith. It was about the idea that truth, my truth, had a power I hadn't yet learned to wield. That idea became a weapon 2 years later, in the dust and heat of Iraq. I was on my first deployment, leading a signal platoon. One sweltering afternoon, a fellow lieutenant from Maine handed me his tablet. "Hey, Cooley, check this out. Your old man's making news back home." On the screen was an article from the Portland Press-Herald. The headline read, "State Senator Cooley, Family and sacrifice are the bedrock of our nation." Below it was a picture of my father, Arthur Cooley, looking statesmanlike and sincere, speaking at a Veterans Day event. He was running for re-election, and his platform was built on the very values he had personally desecrated. A wave of nausea washed over me, so intense I nearly gagged. My father, the man who had called my unborn child a sin and me a vessel. The man who spoke of sacrifice from the comfort of his air-conditioned office while his own daughter was a world away in a combat zone. He was using the very words that defined my existence, family and sacrifice, as empty props for his political ambition. He had stolen my pain and turned it into a talking point. As if the universe had a sick sense of irony, a mail delivery arrived that same day. In it was a letter with my mother's familiar script. The timing was almost comical in its cruelty. I took it back to my sweltering tent, the distant thud of a mortar, a dull counterpoint to the pounding in my head. I tore it open. It was the same hollow refrain. "Your father has changed. He asks about Rachel all the time. Family should be together." I read the letter under the weak glow of a single light bulb, the words blurring with the rage in my eyes. They hadn't changed. This wasn't about love or reconciliation. This was about control. Maybe his political advisors had told him an estranged military daughter was a bad look. Maybe they just wanted to pull me back into their orbit to silence the one person who knew the truth. I didn't write back. I didn't even crumple the letter in anger. I calmly walked outside, into the cool of the desert night. I found an empty burn barrel, a rusty steel drum we used for trash. I held a lighter to the corner of the envelope. The paper caught, the flame greedily consuming my mother's pretty words, turning them into black, curling ash. As I watched the last ember die, I realized something with chilling clarity. That fire hadn't just destroyed a letter. It had incinerated the last, foolish vestiges of hope for an easy reconciliation. Peace could not be built on a foundation of lies. True forgiveness could only come after the truth was acknowledged. And my father, Arthur Cooley, would never acknowledge the truth willingly. Not unless I made him. I went back to my tent and looked at my uniform, hanging neatly, ready for the next mission. He could talk about honor. I was living it. My path was clear. From now on, the Cooley family the world knew would be the family of General Cooley, not politician Arthur Cooley. It was no longer just a dream. It was a mission. The years between my mission in Iraq and my promotion to brigadier general were a blur of deployments, command posts, and relentless dedication. I had built my fortress, brick by brick, star by star. I now lived in a quiet, stately home in Arlington, Virginia, a world away from the attic apartment in Portland. 21 years after they threw me into the snow, I invited my family to my home for the first time. It was not an olive branch. It was a summons. The moment my father's black Lincoln sedan pulled into my driveway, the air grew thick with unspoken history. My aide-de-camp, a sharp young captain, met them at the door with crisp military formality. "Welcome to General Cooley's residence," he said, his emphasis on my title a subtle but clear opening salvo. My father, Arthur Cooley, stepped out of the car. Age and illness had stooped his shoulders, but he still carried himself with an air of unearned authority. My mother trailed behind him, a nervous shadow, while Daniel, now a balding corporate lawyer, looked around with a proprietary air, as if assessing the value of the property. But as they stepped into my living room, their confidence began to falter. This was not their territory. The room was filled not with family photos, but with the faces of my chosen family. Frank Riley sat in an armchair by the fireplace, looking as solid and immovable as a mountain. My old drill sergeant, now a sergeant major, stood near the window, his posture radiating discipline. Diaz, now a decorated captain herself, stood beside him. They were all in their dress uniforms, a silent, formidable wall of honor and earned respect. This was my arena. My father, ever the politician, attempted to seize control of the narrative. He cleared his throat and began a prepared speech, his voice resonating with the false sincerity I knew so well. "We all make mistakes in the past," he began, his gaze sweeping over the room, but avoiding mine. "The important thing is that family finds a way to forgive, to move on." He spoke of my success as if it were a natural extension of his own legacy, the prodigal daughter finally making good. He was trying to reframe 21 years of cruelty and neglect as a simple mistake. Daniel stood beside him, nodding in solemn agreement. My mother just stared at the intricate pattern on the Persian rug, a portrait of silent complicity. I let him finish. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped calmly behind my back, my face an unreadable mask of military composure. My silence was more unnerving to him than any outburst could have ever been. When his voice trailed off into the heavy quiet, I finally spoke. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension like a razor, clear and cold and carrying the weight of command. "No, Mr. Cooley," I said, using his surname like a formal charge. "We will not move on. Before we can speak of forgiveness, we must first speak of the truth." I turned my head slightly, addressing my other guests, my voice never wavering. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, "I'd like to introduce you to the family that gave me my name. 21 years ago, on a cold January night, this man informed me that I was a vessel of sin and threw me out of his house and into a blizzard because I was pregnant with my daughter." A collective sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. I let the words hang in the air, a formal indictment. This woman, I continued, my gaze shifting to my mother, stood by a window and watched in silence as her only daughter was cast out. My mother flinched as if struck, a soft whimper escaping her lips. And this man, I finished, my eyes landing on my brother, smiled as I fell. He called me trash, and then he and his wife tried to take my child from me. The room was utterly, deathly silent. The carefully constructed facade of Arthur Cooley, respected state senator, honorable family man, shattered into a million pieces. He stood there, exposed, not in front of his constituents, but in front of soldiers, people for whom words like honor and loyalty were not political props, but sacred covenants. In their unblinking, judgmental eyes, he wasn't a powerful politician. He was just a coward, a weak, old man stripped bare by a truth he could no longer spin or deny. He looked at me then, truly looked at me. He wasn't looking at the girl he had thrown away. He was looking at a general of the United States Army, a woman who commanded thousands, a woman who held all the power in this room. He saw eyes that held no fear of him, no need for his approval, only the cold, hard glint of unforgiving strength. His face, already pale from his illness, turned ashen. His lips trembled, parting as if to form a defense, but no words came. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. And then, it happened. The words I'd waited a lifetime to hear, not in a desperate plea for his love, but as the terms of his unconditional surrender. They came out as a ragged, strangled whisper, barely audible but echoing like a cannon blast in the silent room. I was wrong. He bowed his head, not in a nod but in a full, profound bow of defeat. It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't a heartfelt plea for forgiveness. It was a capitulation. It was the complete and total surrender of his power over me. And in that moment, the invisible chains of shame and inadequacy that had been wrapped around my heart for 21 years simply dissolved. They turned to dust and blew away. My aide-de-camp, sensing the shift, stepped forward. "I can show you out," he said, his voice polite but firm. They left without another word, a silent, defeated procession. After they were gone, my guests quietly dispersed, leaving me alone in the sudden stillness of my living room. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I just felt quiet, free. My gaze drifted to the wall over the mantelpiece, my legacy wall, as Rachel called it. It was filled with photographs and medals from my career, my OCS graduation, posed photos with my platoon in Iraq, my promotion ceremonies. I walked over to a small wooden box on a side table and opened it. Inside was a single, faded photograph I had never displayed. It was a candid shot a friend had taken just weeks before I was thrown out, of a scared, hopeful 18-year-old girl with the whole world in her eyes. I took the old photograph out of the box, walked to the wall, and placed it right in the center, next to my official portrait as a brigadier general. The frightened girl and the powerful woman, side by side. They were one and the same. Without that girl, there could never have been this general. Several years after that confrontation, on a quiet Christmas Eve, my old family was once again in my house. But this time, the air was different. It wasn't thick with tension, but rather thin with a polite, carefully maintained distance. There was no loud, boisterous holiday cheer, just the soft murmur of conversation, the scent of roasting turkey, and the quiet hum of a new, fragile kind of peace. My father, Arthur, was a different man. The years and his failing health had stripped him of his booming authority, leaving behind a frail, quiet old man who seemed lost in the grandeur of my living room. He spoke in short, hesitant sentences and looked at Rachel with a sort of bewildered wonder. Daniel, ever the awkward middleman now, made a strained effort to talk to Rachel about law school. He was clumsy, his questions generic, but he was trying. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. The deep wounds of the past hadn't magically vanished, but the relationship was no longer a war zone. It was a carefully negotiated truce, an accepted reality. Over the years, I'd come to understand what forgiveness truly was. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the pain never happened. For me, forgiveness was about taking away their power to hurt me anymore. It was an act of self-preservation, the final step in building my fortress. During a quiet moment, I found my mother, Eleanor, standing before my legacy wall. She was gazing at the collection of photographs that told my story, not the one she had tried to write for me, but the one I'd written for myself. Her eyes traced over the photo of Rachel pinning on my first officer bar, a picture of Frank Riley, solemn and proud, and photos of the brave young soldiers I had commanded, some of whom never made it home. Interspersed among them were crayon drawings Rachel had made for me over the years, bright splashes of color amidst the uniformed seriousness. My mother stood there for a long time, her hand covering her mouth. When she finally turned to me, her eyes were filled with a profound, quiet sorrow. I miss so much, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. I didn't offer empty platitudes or easy absolution. I simply placed a hand on her shoulder, a touch that was steady and calm. Yes, you did, I said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact, a truth that had to be acknowledged before anything new could begin. But you're here now. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. A new foundation, built not on the shifting sands of lies, but on the bedrock of a fragile, shared truth. Later that evening, Rachel, now a brilliant and fiercely compassionate law student at Georgetown, came and stood beside me, watching the quiet family tableau. She had her grandmother's wisdom and a strength that was all her own. You know, she said softly, I read somewhere that family isn't the people who never break your heart. It's the people who show up with the glue. She glanced over at her grandparents and her uncle, her expression not one of anger, but of a gentle, knowing acceptance that was far beyond her years. She was the living, breathing proof that a strong, beautiful tree could grow from the most barren and broken ground. She was my greatest victory, the one that mattered more than any star or medal. To honor the man who had first shown me a door where I only saw walls, I had used some of my savings to establish a small scholarship fund. It was called the Frank Riley Foundation, and it provided grants to the children of single mothers serving in the armed forces. It was my way of taking the pain of my own past and transforming it into a promise for someone else's future. It was my glue. The story ends here, but my life, of course, goes on. It ends not on a battlefield or in a tense family reunion, but here, in the pre-dawn stillness of my office at the Pentagon. I'm standing at the window, a warm mug of coffee in my hands, looking out over the sleeping city of Washington, D.C. In the distance, the Washington Monument pierces the soft, gray light of the coming day. The single silver star on my shoulder feels solid, a familiar and reassuring weight. But it is no longer a weapon against my past. It is not a trophy of my father's defeat. It is simply a part of who I am now. My past is no longer a ghost that haunts me. I faced it. I owned it. I integrated it into my own legacy. The scared 18-year-old girl in the snow is not a memory I run from. She is the foundation upon which I stand. My victory was never about his surrender. It was not about the rank on my collar or the power I wielded. My true victory is the quiet peace that now settles in my soul as I watch the sunrise. It is the freedom that comes from knowing, without a doubt, who you are. I, Jessica Cooley, the girl who was once discarded as a vessel of sin, have redefined everything. I have redefined honor. I have redefined loyalty. And most importantly, I've redefined the very meaning of the word family. This time, on my own terms. And that is my story. It's a story about fighting, but more than that, it's about rebuilding. It's proof that the family you build can be stronger than the one you were born into, and that your past does not have to be your future. Thank you for listening and for being a part of this journey with me. If my story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to this channel where we believe in the power of sharing our truths. And in the comments below, I'd be honored if you would share just one word about what this story meant to you. Your strength inspires us all.